This afternoon's talk is part of a key initiative of the McFarland Center for the Future, Catholics and Cultures, which aims to build on our understanding of how Catholicism is lived and practiced in countries around the world. We'll be launching a website next year showing some diverse ways that Catholics practice their faith in places such as El Salvador, Hong Kong, India, Ethiopia, Denmark, Uganda, and Brazil. We're also fortunate to have a number of other scholars visit Holy Cross to present their work and illustrate their lectures. We've got some students involved in some research on that, and I'm excited about that. Last spring, anthropologist Anya Peterson-Royce presented her decades of research on Mexico's Zapotec people and their blends of indigenous and Catholic rituals. Today, I'm really happy to welcome Stephen Selka, also from Indiana University, who's been studying the fascinating cultures of Afro-Catholicism in Brazil. Steve is Associate Professor of American Studies and Religious Studies at Indiana University. His research focuses on where religions intersect and how religion influences social activism, tourism development, and heritage preservation. He's the author of Religion and Politics of Ethnic Identity in Bahia, Brazil, and is now working on a book about the Sisterhood of Good Death, called Boa Morte, which he'll talk about today. So please join me in welcoming Steve Selka.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Tom, and to the Center for bringing me in here to what could be called, I guess, the Indiana University Lecture Series, if we were to retitle it, since I'm following Anya, my colleague at Indiana. And as we were talking about earlier, it's great to really have it emphasized that we have at least two people at Indiana working on these interesting issues. So I changed the title of my talk a little bit, slightly. You may not even notice it's so slight. Our Lady of Good Death, Afro-Catholicism, and the Brazilian Cultural Heritage. I think the original title said something about Brazilian national identity, but I'm going to focus today primarily on the idea of cultural heritage. And the framing issues that will guide my talk today are the lack of attention to Catholicism in studies of African American religion, first of all, which tend to focus on Protestant Christianity and to a lesser extent Islam. And to a certain degree, this is understandable since historically black churches have played such a central role in African American communities and in African American history, as has Islam to maybe a lesser extent. And looking nationwide, 5% of African Americans are Catholic versus 24% in the population as a whole. But if the primary field that I would kind of situate myself in, or one of the primary fields that I would situate myself in, would be African diaspora studies, and it's that field and its relative neglect of Catholicism that I'll talk about a little bit today, in the midst of describing the practices and rituals of a particular Afro-Catholic organization. So African diaspora studies has tended to focus on African-derived religions, including Candomblé, Santeria, and Voodoo, and to a lesser extent, Pentecostalism. And I'm using African diaspora studies here as in a sort of broad and in some ways problematic way to refer to studies of people of African descent in the Americas outside of North America. And there's sort of an implicit, when I use the term in that problematic way, there's the insinuation that people of African descent in North America aren't part of the diaspora, and that's not what I mean to imply. But I am, in terms of scholarship and disciplinary boundaries, there's often kind of a separation between African American studies and African diaspora studies. And African diaspora studies often focus on Candomblé, Santeria, Voodoo, and related religions, including Rastafarianism as well. And the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, many of the countries that we're talking about, including Haiti, Brazil, which I'll talk about a lot today, these are countries that for most of their histories, Catholicism has been the official religion, and so Catholicism is kind of always in the background. And so with respect to Pentecostalism, what's often going on in studies of Pentecostalism in the African diaspora is, at least in the beginning, when scholars started to pay attention to the growth of Pentecostalism in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, Pentecostalism was often seen, at least in black communities, as sort of a continuation of deep African religious logics. So it got read as something that was surface as opposed to a deeper structure of African religion, African religious logics. And similarly, Catholicism often gets interpreted as a facade or a veneer. So one of the senses of religious syncretism is that, that term might connote mixture of two religions, but in some ways that term is used to suggest that there's a kind of primary religion that's practiced behind a sort of public religion that the religious practitioners are not necessarily earnestly invested in. So we can trace the genealogy of this idea of this focus on African-derived religions like Candomblé to a number of sources, but today I'm going to focus mainly on the idea of cultural heritage, and that the way that the African diasporic heritage is defined in a way marginalizes Catholicism. And I'll walk through how that happens in my discussion of the Sisterhood of Our Lady of the Good Death, which in Portuguese is A Irmandade de Nossa Senhora da Boa Morte. I'll refer to this group as Boa Morte from now on. And it's an Irmandade that was founded in Salvador, Bahia in the 19th century, mostly by free women of color. An Irmandade is a lay devotional organization, usually, or always to my knowledge, devoted to a particular patron saint. And Irmandades in Spanish-speaking Latin America are usually referred to as cofradias. Irmandades played a key role during the colonial period and beyond in places like Brazil, partly because of the shortage of priests. Irmandades sort of stepped in and were responsible for the maintenance of churches when priests were doing the rounds, celebrating popular feast days, and so on. And for people of African descent, for Africans arriving in Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti, these organizations provided they to some extent served as orientation centers for newly arrived Africans, where they were oriented towards the culture of the place that they were forcibly brought to, not only oriented by slave owners and by overseers, but by fellow members of these Irmandades or cofradias that often came from similar ethnic groups or the same ethnic groups. But at the same time, Irmandades often played a very different role than serving as orientation centers. They were, in fact, places where African religious traditions were maintained. And so, to a certain extent, what I'm going to be talking about here today is how I'm going to be arguing against the idea that Irmandades were simply places where African religious traditions were preserved and the Catholicism was just sort of a thin veneer. But at the same time, I can't deny that these were places that African religious practices were in fact maintained. That was part of what was going on. So the Irmandade of Boa Morte celebrates the Feast of the Assumption. So Good Death, Boa Morte refers to Mary's good death. She was assumed body and soul into heaven. And so, particularly today, the Irmandade exists to celebrate this festival in mid-August. At the same time, all of the members of Boa Morte are women of African descent initiated into Candomblé. So I'm going to give you some pictures now and come back to the text in a second. So here we've got a handy map of Brazil with Bahia highlighted in light green. It's a state in northeastern Brazil where the majority of slaves arrived when they came to when they were brought to South America or brought to Brazil. And here's a picture of Salvador, the capital of Bahia, which is where Boa Morte was founded in the early 19th century. This is the historical center of Salvador called Pelourinho. Now, Boa Morte in the late 19th, early 20th century moved to the countryside, moved away from the big city to the interior of Brazil, the interior of Bahia. So there are actually paved roads that lead to the interior, but here's a nice sort of rustic picture of the Bahian countryside. And although it's quite beautiful, this is the area where sugarcane agriculture. This was the center of sugarcane agriculture for most of the colonial period. This is the town of Cachoeira, where Boa Morte currently resides, and it's a small colonial town. The city center is home to about maybe 10,000 residents, and the entire city, including the outlying hamlets, is about 30,000 people. As you can see, the city, most of the architecture is from the 16th, 17th centuries. So here's a picture from the Festival of Boa Morte, and I'll go through and just sort of map out the major happenings that are part of this festival. So it's a 5-day festival. The first 3 days of the festival are what the sisters refer to as the sacred part of the festival, and this is the celebration of the Feast of the Assumption. And so on the first day, what we have is the sisters gather. They've gathered here in a chapel behind a building that today serves as their headquarters. About 15 years ago, the state of Bahia, American philanthropists and wealthy Bahians contributed money to buy them a headquarters, like a 3-story building that houses a dormitory, kitchen, museum, and so on. And behind it, there's a chapel, which in fact was the only space that they had to celebrate this festival for most of their time in Cachoeira. And this is where the first part of the festival begins. So we've got the sisters all gathered around, holding candles, and what we've got here is Mary, Mary reclining. I hesitate to. There's a sort of a theological question of whether she's considered at this point to be dead or sleeping that I'll sort of gloss over, but I'll come back to that question in a future slide. So that's the first day. The second day, the sisters come out and process through the streets in wearing black. So this is sort of very reminiscent of a funeral procession. And in a way, that's how this is framed. Mary is being carried through the streets as if she were going to be buried. And in a way, this is also a celebration or a commemoration of the sisters' ancestors, the women who first founded the Irmandade da Boa Morte. And so here it's kind of a dark photo, but you can see two things. You see the reclined image of Mary, and she's being carried through the streets by pallbearers. So this is exactly what a funeral would look like for a local, if a local person died. This is what the funeral would look like, except you wouldn't have all the paparazzi on both sides. But of course, Mary's not being carried in a coffin. She's being carried on a bed, right? So there's sort of hints of she's dead, but there's also hints of she's sleeping here, and it's sort of indeterminate. But let me bring your attention to the paparazzi on both sides. So this is a festival that has become somewhat of a media spectacle and a tourist destination, and that's part of the frame. That's part of the background of this talk that I'll get to in a few minutes. But you can see also the visitors on both sides of the procession, perhaps even better in this slide because the light is better. This is the third day. This is the feast of the actual day of the Feast of the Assumption, and the sisters are no longer wearing black, they're wearing red, which is for them, this is a sign of it's a joyous color, and they're celebrating the Assumption of Mary in the person of Our Lady of Glory. Right, so this is a different image of Mary that's being carried through the streets on procession, and she's carrying red roses. So the red is highly symbolic here. This is the mass that happens on the Feast of the Assumption. You can see the sisters on the side here, and the priest celebrating the mass. This is Padre Elio, who I'll talk about in just a minute. He's been the parish priest of Cachoeira for on and off for about 20 years. So Candomblé, I mentioned Candomblé, which is, for those who aren't familiar, it's an African-derived religion practiced in Brazil. It is mainly focused on the veneration of orishas, which are African spirits or gods, among other spirits. Orishas are not the only spirits that are venerated in Candomblé, but in this context, perhaps the most important. And practices in Candomblé, right here we see a Candomblé priestess or a Maiji Santo presiding over a toki, which would be a public possession ritual. So spirit possession is central, as is animal sacrifice, healing, and those are some of the primary practices. Here we have the same Maiji Santo, Hayulda, presiding over. This is actually a photo taken during the festival of Bom Morte. None of the sisters of Bom Morte are in attendance at this Candomblé ceremony, even though they are all involved in Candomblé, because during the festival they stay together in a dormitory in Bom Morte's headquarters. But what's important about this particular Candomblé toki is it's for the Orisha Omolu, who's associated with death and with healing and sickness, and also with death. And he's venerated in the month of August. So people make a somewhat obvious connection between Our Lady of Good Death, whose festival happens in August, and Omolu, who happens to be venerated in August. And so to bring the S word back into the conversation, this would be an example of religious syncretism, at least at first glance. And so Hayilda is grabbing onto popcorn, which is one of it's a sacred food for Omolu, and she'll be spreading it around the temple as a blessing. Much tastier than holy water. So now Candomblé is present, even though this is a sort of formally Catholic ceremony. Candomblé is present if you know what you're looking for, I guess. First of all, you can notice this is a sister of Bom Morte, and you notice that she's wearing the same sort of basic garb, the dress and the head wrap, as the women in this Candomblé temple. So the clothing it's traditional clothing that's worn by Bahian women, and particularly Afro-Bahian women in a variety of contexts, including these religious contexts. And then what's more, these necklaces, colares, each indicate a particular spirit or orisha. So that's a very clear sign of initiation or involvement in Candomblé. Here we have, this is Dona Dalva she's decked out with some elaborate colares, getting ready to greet the paparazzi at the beginning of the festival of Bom Morte. Okay, so by the 1960s and 70s, most Irmandades in Brazil were in decline. One of the reasons for this, around the turn of the 20th century, the functions that Irmandades served kind of passed from religious organizations to the state and to other sorts of institutions. So Irmandades formed a sort of social aid kind of organization. Members would pool together resources and to provide aid to members that were, that had fallen upon hard times, that kind of thing. But over the course of the 20th century, the state and other institutions, to some degree, filled in those functions, but not entirely. Also, Catholicism changed over the course of the 20th century. Movements like Catholic Action and Liberation Theology, to a large extent, to some extent, moved away from this kind of devotion to saints model of popular Catholicism. So, there were a number of black Irmandades in Cachoeira in the 1970s that disappeared in this period. Over the course of the 1970s, were disbanded. But Bolo Morchi ended up undergoing a revitalization. And that revitalization was grounded in a number of things, one of which I'll talk about in more depth than the others. But the state of Bahia in the 60s and 70s became very concerned with the preservation and valorization, is the term that's used, of Bahian heritage, particularly Afro-Bahian heritage. And Bolo Morchi became sort of a symbol, an emblem, an icon of that. And at the same time, more towards the end of the 1970s was the period of the florescence, the emergence of the Brazilian black consciousness movement. And in that context, Bolo Morchi also was seen as sort of an emblem. The sisters were seen as, at least their ancestors were seen as having resisted slavery, particularly by pooling together resources to buy their family members, for example, out of slavery, that kind of thing. And then tourism, African American tourism in particular, really brought attention to and resources to Bolo Morchi in the starting in the late 1970s, but this intensified. This ethnic tourism intensified in the 80s. So, but what brought Bolo Morchi onto the national stage, perhaps more than anything else, was this event that the media labeled a holy war. It began in 1989, and the parish priest, the very priest that I showed you a picture of in the previous slide, Padre Elio, refused to give the sisters of Bolo Morchi access to the images used in their festival, and you saw a couple of them in the slides that I just showed you. Images of Mary, plus the jewels that the sisters used to adorn her during the processions. And he locked them up in the Igreja Matriz, the main church of the town, and said that they belonged to the church and not to this lay Irmandade. And part of his justification for this was that the Irmandade did not have official documents that sort of sealed its position or that legitimized its position as a group within the Catholic Church. And that caused some friction because the sisters believed that they did have that document or that it had been lost. A lot of debate around that. But locals speculate that the other thing that was going on is Padre Elio was jealous of the attention that Bolo Morchi was garnering. And that the Catholic Church was sort of in the background of this attention. What's the even wider context for this is 1989 was in the middle of a period where the Archbishop of Salvador, of this area, was seeking to sort of to desyncretize the practice of Catholicism in Bahia, to eliminate the presence of Candomblé in popular Catholic ceremonies. So Irmandades like Bolo Morchi were targets for his campaign to install a more orthodox kind of Roman Catholicism in Bahia. With the help of a local lawyer, a woman named Celina, whose family had lived in Cachoeira for many generations and whose family was a patron of Bolo Morchi, they took the Catholic Church to court and eventually won that case. They were helped by a number of very high-profile public figures, including one of the Bahia's senators, and by the author Jorge Amado, who had a very, he has an international reputation, and both of those figures, among others, sort of weighed in for Boa Morte. And the problem was that the Archbishop Dom Lucas was going against so many different currents in Bahian culture that, I mean, his effort to kind of to separate the practice of Catholicism and Candomblé was probably doomed from the beginning. So Boa Morte eventually prevailed, but not surprisingly was estranged from the Catholic Church for about 10 years. And the end of this estrangement coincides with Dom Lucas leaving Brazil for the Vatican. And he was replaced by an administration that was very much concerned with enculturation theology, with sort of adapting the Catholic liturgy and practice to local cultures. And so in '98, which is right on the cusp of where I started doing my research in Bahia, at least some groups within the Catholic Church were trying to create dialogue with the Candomblé community. And all of a sudden, Boa Morte was, the church reconciled with Boa Morte, and the first Mass in 10 years with a Catholic priest was celebrated in '98, '99, one of those years. And it was Padre Elio, the guy who originally, sort of had kept the images from the sisters. So, but during in those intervening years, the sisters sought out priests to celebrate the Mass, right? So the first year after the split from the church, they sought out a local priest in the Brazilian Catholic Church in Cachoeira. And the Brazilian Catholic Church is an offshoot that separated from the Catholic Church. Some of the platforms, some of the items on the platform were similar to the items on the platform of the Church of England when it separated from the Roman Catholic Church. Divorce, the right of priests to marry, and so on, or the ability for priests to marry, and so on. But particularly in Bahia, and particularly in Cachoeira, another characteristic of the Brazilian Catholic Church is that it presents itself as being more open to Candomblé than the Roman Catholic Church. So it was not a coincidence that was the first place that the sisters went. But when that sort of fizzled out, for reasons I'm not entirely sure and still researching, the sisters sought out Orthodox priests, Greek Orthodox priests, anyone within the Catholic Orthodox tradition, imagine broadly, to celebrate the festival, particularly the Mass. So some of the issues that this brings up, despite the importance of the images of Mary and the participation of the priest in the festival, many resist the characterization of Boa Morte as a Catholic celebration. In some of my writing about Boa Morte, I've referred to Boa Morte as a formally Catholic organization. And the formally, is somewhat of a hedge. And I've still had readers write me asking me what I mean by that, people who've attended the festival and have asked me, well, is it really Catholic? Or my understanding was this was an African or Candomblé ceremony sort of masquerading as a Catholic celebration. And I'll get into that more in just a second. But part of how this, a big part of the story of how this happened is as Boa Morte was integrated into the story of Bahia's cultural heritage, it became increasingly Africanized. So I'll give you a quick overview of heritage as a discourse and as an issue in Bahia over the course of the 20th century. At the turn of the 20th century, Candomblé and other practices that were coded as Afro-African or Afro-Brazilian, like samba, were seen as obstacles to progress and modernization. So Candomblé was persecuted and prosecuted. You could be There was a whole sort of legal, sub-legal system devoted to prosecuting people accused of sorcery. And it wasn't really until the early 70s that Candomblé temples were freed of the requirement to register with local police before performing any ceremonies. Samba, the Afro, sort of a Brazilian, now recognized as a Brazilian national dance, was seen as something disorderly, socially unhygienic, and there were efforts to keep it out of public spaces. But by the middle of the 20th century, Brazil's national identity was sort of refashioned along the lines of Brazil as a mixed-race nation. And if you're familiar with other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, this is a familiar story. And one of the architects of this new imagination of Brazil's national identity was the anthropologist Gilberto Freire, an anthropologist trained in the U.S., but who looked at, he took Brazil's African heritage and sort of re-signified it as not something that was holding Brazil back, but sort of a pillar of Brazilian identity, one of the pillars of Brazil's identity. I mean, there's a lot of problematic things having to do with Gilberto Freire that I'm going to gloss over because of time. But he did kind of reframe, re-signify the importance of African culture, African practices, African descent in the Brazilian national imagination. Now, of course, religious syncretism fits perfectly well into this story because it's all about mixture usually of Catholicism, Candomblé, to some extent indigenous religion, and so on. So Boa Morte represented and continues to represent for some people the theme of a harmonious mixture between the African and the European. Despite the Holy War, which was obviously disrupted this narrative of harmonious mixture, Boa Morte does sort of fit into this idea of Baianidade, or Bahian identity, as consisting in cordial relations between Europeans and Africans. And in fact, the line between European and African being particularly blurry. But the scene changes with the advent of roots tourism. And I'm going to suggest that the emphasis shifted from mixture to purity. And roots tourism refers mainly to tourism, to African Americans who come to Bahia according to Bahians to look for their African roots. In parentheses, I'm going to note that there are many other reasons that African Americans go to Bahia that don't have to do with this sense of finding their African roots. But for the purposes of what I'm talking about today, that's what I'm going to focus in on. And so starting in the 1970s, actually it started before that, but in the 1970s, African American roots tourism became more intense. This was in the context of Alex Haley's Roots. And many of the prime destination in the 1960s, 1970s, particularly 1970s, was West Africa. And as you may or may not be aware of, over the course of the 19th and 20th century, African Americans writing about their experience in Africa or talking about their experience in Africa have mixed reports about their reception, right? African Americans are often not necessarily greeted as long lost kin, and in the most extreme sort of example, African Americans are referred to by the same term that Africans use in particular places to refer to white foreigners. So it's in this context that Bahia stresses that it's the place in the African diaspora where African culture has survived in its purest form. Also, Bahia in the 1970s starts to develop 1970s, particularly by the 1990s, starts to develop an explicit sort of focus on African American tourists, right? On being welcoming, on sort of catering to this idea of looking for African roots. And So I said that this shift from mixture to purity happened with the advent of roots tourism, but in fact this dates back to the early history of anthropology in Brazil. It was the first anthropologists, like on the American side, Melville Herskovits, on the Brazilian side, Edson Carneiro, who stressed that Brazil was amazing. One of the things that was amazing about it was that it was a place where, practices that had long since disappeared in West Africa continued in a very highly institutionalized form. And today in Bahia, you will hear people say that Salvador is more African than Africa. And what's being insinuated there is that particularly Nigeria, Ghana, we have places that have been where the majority of the population are Muslim or Christian, and where the African indigenous religious practices are sort of more scattered, less institutionalized than they are in Salvador. And in fact, if you've been to Salvador, and I should have had some images of Salvador to go along with this, but Candomblé is a very public presence in Salvador. There are statues of the Orishas everywhere, right? So it's not something that's hidden. It's very, very, very prominent. So in this view, Brazil, rather than Africa, is the logical place to find African roots. At least this is the way that heritage promoters were imagining this. So in that context, descriptions of Bolo Morchi often referred to it as something like a living testament to African culture in the Americas. And these kinds of descriptions for visitors, for tourists and other visitors, would often mention Catholicism, but the emphasis would be on African culture or African religion in the Americas. More specifically, the most common connection that's drawn is between the Sisterhood of Bolo Morchi and women's secret societies in West Africa, including Gele Days, which are very similar to Bolo Morchi in broad ways. They're organizations made up of women who need to be initiated. They keep secrets. They're all past menopause. They're rumored to be very spiritually powerful. They're accused of being witches. So there are connections. These are not baseless speculations, but no one has really kind of drawn the line of continuity. So in that perspective, Catholicism becomes sort of the surface under which the real religious practice happens, the deep grammar of African religious logics. But the operation that has to take place to make Catholicism sort of disappear is a little more complex than just saying, all right, this is a facade, this is a show, this is a performance. There's a kind of temporal displacement that observers bring to Bolo Morchi. In other words, in order to read the Catholicism out of the picture or to erase it from the story, or at least to move it from the foreground to the background, observers often look at Bolo Morchi as if they're looking through a window to the past. So observers often frame Bolo Morchi as a commemoration of the ancestors' struggles, which is actually a characterization that the sisters themselves wouldn't resist, and in fact that they often voice. So this is not a baseless sort of characterization. At the same time, the sisters' talk about their own practice has been shaped by 4 decades of engagement with the heritage industry and tourists. So it's difficult to disentangle these characterizations. But the idea here is that the sisters' ancestors, the founders of the Irmandade da Bolo Morchi, were involved in struggling against slavery, and what's going on is this sort of reenactment of that, a reenactment of their struggle. And so from that point of view, the current day sisters aren't actually practicing Catholicism, they're performing resistance to it. They're not actually Catholics, they're performing their ancestors' resistance to it. So that's a more specific way in which Catholicism sort of is made to fade into the background. Let me very quickly get a little more specific and talk about the views that sort of are typical of three different groups of African American visitors to Bolmorchi. So, I mean, half of my work with Bolmorchi focused on the sisters and their neighborhoods and their temples and their lives, and the other half focused on African American visitors. There was often, Cachoeira is a small town, there's often not a tour guide who speaks English, so there were a couple of years where I was a tour guide for groups, and I took advantage of that to, to engage in informal conversations about a lot of these issues. I also distributed questionnaires at a number of festivals of Bolmorchi over the years. But I mean, I think that it's fair to say that most of the visitors to American visitors to Bolmorchi are Protestant, and more often than not, they're members of and come in groups organized by historically African American churches, United Church of Christ, and so on. And most, perhaps 2/3, if not more, of the visitors are women. And so many, they often read Bolmorchi as having to do with black women's negotiation of two religious cultures. And this is a way of kind of both affirming the connections between what's going on with African American women and Afro-Brazilian women, the connections, but also recognizing the difference. But with respect to Catholicism, what happens here is that the specificity of Catholicism sort of gets pushed out of the picture. In other words, Bolmorchi gets folded into this story of Christianity versus a generic story of Christianity versus African culture. And so the fact that it's specifically grounded in Catholicism isn't really part of the narratives that the Protestant women are telling about the Irmandade. The visitors are telling about Bolmorchi to themselves. Spiritual seekers. Now, spiritual seekers certainly can overlap with Protestants, and tend to stress how Bolmorchi represents the expression of feminine spirituality. And spiritual seekers are sort of characterized by a sensibility that isn't grounded in any one or even two specific religious traditions. It's sort of, I hesitate to say New Age because of all the connotations of that, but that's the closest sort of gloss that I can bring to this. Although Oprah Winfrey's kind of eclectic approach to spirituality is another reference here, and sometimes it's an explicit reference. Oprah Winfrey's talk about spirituality is grounded in Christian idioms, but draws upon Buddhism and draws upon spirit possession, and that's the kind of sensibility that we're talking about here. But with respect to the Catholic side of Bolmorchi, it does the same. This framing Bolmorchi as an example of feminine spirituality does the same thing that framing it as in terms of the generic struggle between Christianity and African religion does. It gets rid of the specificity of Catholicism, and in particular, the Sisterhood of Bolmorchi, both in its Candomblé and Catholic aspects, is an organization that's heavily grounded in kind of embodied ritual participation. In order to become part of a Candomblé community, you need to be initiated. You need to spend months in isolation. You need to undergo specific rituals that bring you into relation with others. And even in the Catholic side, the Irmandade requires people to spend 3 years as novitiates, sort of like someone entering a convent. There's a series of stages that you go through in order to become a full member. And the sisters are talked about as sisters. I mean, they are the sisters of Bolmorchi. And so on the Catholic side, that kinship idiom is used. On the Candomblé side also, people talk about their relationship with other people in their temple in terms of brotherhood, sisterhood, fatherhood, motherhood, that kind of thing. Many of the spiritual seekers, or many of the African American visitors, also use this kinship idiom, sister, to refer to the Sisters of Bolmorchi, and rightly so, but it often slips into the kind of African American vernacular understanding of sister to include black women sort of generally. And that's not necessarily problematic, but from the perspective of what I'm talking about today, what it does is it sort of glosses over the way that idiom of kinship works for the sisters, which is that relation comes about through a long period of embodied ritual interaction. And it's not just a kind of ephemeral, universal sort of spirituality. Lastly, Yoruba revivalists are usually, this is a term often used to refer to African Americans who've been initiated into African religious traditions either in the U.S. or Africa. And the revivalism has to do with sort of bringing back Yoruba culture and religion separately from Christianity. So Yoruba revivalists often argue that Catholicism should be rooted out of Santeria and Candomblé. And this is a tension often between African American practitioners of Yoruba religions and Cuban practitioners of Santeria in the United States, who make up perhaps the bulk of practitioners of these kinds of religions in the U.S. In fact, African Americans who, in the 60s and 70s, African Americans in Brooklyn who took part in Cuban Santeria communities in the 70s and 80s split off from those communities to form their own temples and other organizations that explicitly, one of the points was to exclude references to Christianity and Catholicism. So, I mean, one of the questions that comes up here is there's always a group from Brooklyn, nearly always a group from Brooklyn that comes for the festival or some other point in the year to visit Bolmorchi. And so what is it? They're usually much better versed on what's going on in Bahia than the average tourist, but they still come to Bolmorchi. And again, I have to go back to this idea of temporal displacement. They're sort of looking at Bolmorchi as a testament to resistance in the past. So let me draw some quick conclusions here. Well, Catholicism appears to be hiding in plain sight here to some extent. And I'm going to use a quote that I think is on the money. Andrew Apter tells us that, reminds us that the Catholicism of Voodoo, Candomblé, and Santeria was not an ecumenical screen hiding the worship of African deities. The slaves took possession of Catholicism and thereby repossessed themselves as active spiritual subjects. And I mean, my discussion of the Holy War brought this to the foreground, I hope. I didn't talk so much about the sisters' own kind of understanding of Our Lady of Bolmorchi and what she means to them, but, and I can talk about that in the Q&A a little bit, but she does, Our Lady of Bolmorchi at times is linked to various orishas or African deities, without a doubt. But she also represents an entity in her own right that isn't reducible to a stand-in for a particular entity in Candomblé. So there's that. And I've tried to talk about some of the reasons why this Catholicism would end up hiding in plain sight. We've got the Africanization of Bahian heritage. And although I didn't really talk about it too explicitly, I mean, there's the stakes in that Africanization are at this level of the state that's interested in developing, that's invested in a sort of multicultural politics of recognition of minority cultures. In Bahia, Afro-Brazilians are certainly not the minority, but in terms of legal status, they're often treated that way. And then tourism. Much of tourism to Bahia focuses on the beach, that's true. But there's the investment in this image of Bahia as the homeland of the African heritage in the Americas is closely tied up with tourism, which is in Latin America and the Caribbean has been offered as a solution to underdevelopment and poverty. So there are material stakes to this sort of heritage, this heritage frame, and in particular the Africanization of the Bahian heritage over the years. Anyway, I think I'm going to end there. It's not exactly a resounding note, but maybe slide us into some questions if you have any.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested in knowing how the sisters themselves view their commodification, and when the tourists started coming, did they encourage it? I noticed they had men like sort of guarding them, it looked like during the procession. But I mean, did they like the attention and like the fact that people were, trying to connect with them?
Yeah.
As a heritage thing.
Right. On the whole, yes. There are some of the older sisters who talk nostalgically about the festival before this period of heritagization or touristization, however we want to call it. And the sisters any resources that were devoted to the festival were resources that they themselves brought. There was a certain kind of autonomy, independence that allowed. But the thing is that with state recognition, which happened late, it happened in the early 2000s. Now the state of Bahia funds the entire festival. They pay the bill. They don't pay for the upkeep of their clothes. That's one thing they have to take care of themselves. But so there's a lot of upside. Now what you see is just the main day of the festival. And the main day of the festival, the city fills up with buses and paparazzi and so on. But it's just one day. The rest of the festival is more, you have tourists in town, but they're more kind of committed to making maybe a deeper connection with the members of the Irmandade. And some of the locals turn up for the events that happen on the other 4 days. And there's a lot of favorable talk about tourism in general, because for decades this has been promoted as the solution to all of Cachoeira's problem. Yeah. So there are people who complain. It's mainly the intellectuals in town that say, "Oh, it's all been spoiled now that they get all this media attention." But the sisters themselves, I mean, their lives are influenced, or although most of them are very poor, their lives are improved in material ways through participation in the sisterhood.
And as it go down from mother to daughter, when the daughter becomes, postmenopausal, then she would be more apt to become a sister than that wasn't in a.
Yeah, that happens, but not always. I'm thinking so there were, over the last couple of years, the numbers hovered around 23, 24 sisters, and there's only one case of, mother-daughter members. So it might be more common. What you more likely have is people who are in a relation of mother-daughter to each other, but through Candomblé, right? So you do have a greater showing from some Candomblé temples than others, right? So there are a number of people who are related by Candomblé initiation, but by blood, there's only one recently that I can name.
For much of your talk, I was thinking of the group, just to help my mind get around it, as like a synodality.
Yeah, that's what it would be.
Okay, but then when you said like a 3-year initiation of like a novitiate, that went away from me.
Oh.
Is a synodality a good analog, or is there a better one?
I've been struggling for a long time to figure out what the matching concept would be in American culture, and I've never succeeded. Because this would be immediately familiar to people studying in Nicaragua or Mexico or Peru. Cofradías, they're very hierarchical, and you serve at a certain level for a number of years before you move up to higher positions. So this is very familiar in Latin America and the Caribbean. But yeah, what's a matching? We just don't really.
I'm wondering, can you leave? So what's the process? The process getting in, other than a good death? How does one?
Yeah, the ones who have left, they leave for evangelical churches. There's one who left for an evangelical church and has been gone for something like, it must be 8 years now. When I first met her, she was always in the headquarters, smoking a pipe, willing to BS with whoever came by. And now for the last 8 years, she's sort of holed up in her house, sort of surrounded by her family, who are all evangelical Christians. There are at least 2 other sisters who did that, who left for a short period of time to join an evangelical church, but came back. But yeah, it's usually evangelical. That's the story. The common story is conversion. But part of my work focuses on conversion back and forth. People who convert to Christianity, then convert back to Candomblé, and there's a lot of traffic between the 2 worlds. Go ahead.
How involved can the tourists get besides being able to see? Are there any practices that kind of develop that really kind of involve them?
Yeah.
Or is it more like a show?
Okay. On the main day of the festival, the Feast of the Assumption, if you're a tourist, you're going to be on the sidelines. And people who know the festival pretty well, including a lot of, over the years I became friends with a lot of the African American visitors, particularly the ones that come back every year. And they recognize that the main day of the festival, you're always going to be on the sidelines because it's a big, massive spectacle. But the other days, the sisters make massive amounts of food, caruru, cozido, which are 2 typical Bahian, Afro-Bahian dishes that they serve to the community. The members of the community say, well, no, it's not really for the members of the community, it's for foreigners. But that's where visitors will be invited into the headquarters and they'll be served a plate of food and they're kind of partaking. And then dancing samba. I mean, I didn't get to the fact that after the 3 days of the sacred part of the festival are over, then it switches to dancing samba, eating these big ritual meals, and so on. So visitors can dance samba with the ladies. They're all like 80, not all of them, but many of them are 80, 90 years old and can kick anyone's butt on the dance floor without even breaking a sweat. So it's kind of fun. But it's a sort of samba, as it's danced here, is samba de roda, samba of the circle. And so it's sort of a circle dance where you get kind of pulled in. And yeah, so there's that. There's one African American woman, Reverend Barbara King from Hillside Truth Center and Chapel, I'm mangling that, in Atlanta, who became an honorary member of Bomorchi. She's not initiated. She's not initiated formally, but because she and her church gave a lot of money to Bomorchi and was very supportive, they made her an honorary sister. And one year I was her translator, so we kind of marched along with the sisters. And that was, but yeah, it's mainly after the same. Go ahead.
Did she dress like the sister?
She did. So, but most African American visitors to the festival will dress in white. They're told to do that it's respectful. However, a lot of the locals don't. And dressing in white signifies initiation into Candomblé. So, I'll do this real quick. Do I have a second? Oh, good. Yeah, I do. So, there was occasionally a group of African American visitors from a conservative evangelical church makes its way to Bomorchi. And again, it's a result of Bomorchi often not being presented as a Catholic feast day, a celebration of a Catholic feast day. It's the result of Bomorchi being framed as some sort of commemoration of resistance to slavery. And so occasionally a conservative group shows up and then eventually figures out not only is this Catholic, but it's grounded in the Brazilian version of voodoo and decides we've got to, basically reverse course here. And one group in particular, it was a church from Houston, came in and asked one of the administrators of Bomorchi, look, where's a Baptist church where we could go and make a connection? And so the the administrator, Bo Morci, took them to the church where his daughter happens to attend school. But the African American church group showed up all dressed in white, as they're requested to do by the tour guide, as the tour guides request that they do. And so the pastor, who I knew from years before when I did some questionnaires with the members of his church, told me that when they came to the door, he was just mystified. He's like, what are all these basically American sorcerers doing showing up at the door of my church? Because he read their white clothing as membership in Candomblé. And so he explained that for days afterwards, there were other pastors in town that were like, what were you doing walking around with those sorcerers from America in the streets? And he had to explain that, no, they're Baptist, but if you look at the Lonely Planet guide for what to do when you're in Bahia, it says, if you go to Candomblé, wear white. And it depends on the ceremony whether you should wear white, but you definitely should avoid dark colors. That's true. But yeah.
Are there men's equivalents, or you've got a man saying mass, we've got you walking in the procession.
Yeah.
You've got people on the side, but where do men, how is it all gendered? Or say more about how it's gendered and where men fit in it.
Okay, yeah, so men play, they tend to play the role of patrons. So Bo Morci has Jorge Amado, the Bahian novelist, was a patron of Bo Morci. Antonio Carlos Magalhães, the former senator from Bahia, also was a patron. So the Candomblé temples and Irmandades like Bo Morci often have like a very powerful white man who is a benefactor. And then there's a group of intellectuals in town who are not necessarily, they would be sort of middle class. They could, some Afro-Brazilian, some white, who are sort of, they're close, they're friends of the Irmandade. And over the years, I went back I've been to maybe eight of these festivals over the course of like 12 years. So eventually I integrated my way into that group. And it was a very decisive moment. I had made good friends with a couple of the sisters, but then the local public television station interviewed me about Bo Morci, and I was on for like 30 seconds talking about the foreigner's view of Bo Morci. And after that, all of the sisters thought, they were very welcoming, and everyone knew my name. So that was how I kind of got into that circle. And when the cameras were on me, I keep talking about, in a way, the subtext of this talk has been that most of the representations of Bo Morci are oversimplified. But the cameras were on me, and I had 30 seconds to talk, and I ended up repeating all the same stuff. Bo Morci is a good example of African resistance against slavery. All of the things that I've sort of tried to complicate here, once the cameras are on me, I just repeated them. So I can see how, and they're true. They're true to a large extent, but they're certainly not the whole story. Yeah. Most are Protestant. The early vanguard in the 70s and 80s it was mostly artists brought by one particular cultural broker, American cultural broker, who worked with Bahian locals to try to promote Bo Morci. And they sort of knew what they were getting into. They would stay for the whole week of the festival and so on. So now this is just one stop on a whirlwind tour of Brazil that includes Bahia, Rio, maybe the Amazon, right? So people aren't always told what to expect, and the Catholicism can be shocking. The fact that this is a formally Catholic ceremony can come as a surprise, but not necessarily. Not everyone seems to be alienated by it. Again, one of the approaches is to just look at the parallels, between the negotiation between two worlds that African American women had to go through in our history, and the parallel with that you could see in Bolmorchi. But so one of the things about, it's not just Mary, it's that Mary is white, and lily white at that. She's not even sort of mixed race, or, Nossa Senhora da Aparecida, who is the patron of Brazil, is dark skinned. But so Mary's very white, and there's been a lot of complaints about that. And one of my friends in Cachoeira is a painter who used to paint scenes of Bolmorchi, and eventually what he did, he heard so many complaints from African Americans that he started painting Mary as black in his paintings, and that helped him, sort of sell his paintings. But it also spoke to one of the reactions that African American visitors have to the Catholicism. So it's puzzling to locals too, because most of what's there to do in Cachoeira? It's a small town. At night, you sit in the plaza, and you sip drinks. And so many of the visitors have a caipirinha or a beer or something like that, and locals are just dumbfounded. How can Protestants be drinking? How can they be real Protestants if they drink alcohol? So there's a lot of befuddlement on the part of Brazilians, particularly in Bahia, who are Protestant. Evangelical is equated with sort of conservative, non-drinking evangelical. So there's a lot of befuddlement on both sides. That's the short answer. Not necessarily among the tourists who know the festival very well and stay for the whole week and come back for year after year. I mean, they sort of understand the commonalities and differences. But a lot of the people who are on the 5-hour whirlwind tour are befuddled on both sides.
When did the evangelical and the Protestant missionaries begin coming to that area? Did they kind of try to stamp out and Catholicism, this kind of worship?
So Pentecostalism grew in Brazil. It first appeared at the beginning of the 20th century, and it really started to take off like wildfire in the 50s and 60s. And to some extent, I mean, it has remained. For most of its history, Pentecostalism and evangelical Christianity has remained sort of marginal. In other words, without access to resources and power that would allow it to stamp out Candomblé, let alone Catholicism. But one of the biggest churches in Brazil owns one of the major TV stations, and is often sort of airing commercials that blame Candomblé. That basically label Candomblé spirits as demons and blame them for all sorts of afflictions, sickness, headaches, depression, and so on. So there is there.
Responsible for the decline of the other sisterhoods, possibly?
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly having that alternative would seem to suggest that. Particularly, as I said, when women leave the Irmandade, the one, other than dying a good death, the other common reason is to convert to evangelical Christianity. So, yeah, certainly. I mean, there's been a number of younger women who have entered the ranks of the novitiate in the past 4 or 5 years or so. So the Irmandade doesn't seem to be in decline. Sure, I would say that evangelical Christianity certainly presents a challenge. However, let me add just quickly that the statistics show that Candomblé and Umbanda and other African derived religions in Brazil aren't on the wane. If anything, there's a little bit of a growth. You would wear the thinner ones, the ones that look like they're kind of made of maybe plastic beads. You would wear those thinner ones most of the time. You would maybe wear the one for your primary orisha most of the time. But the big, heavy necklaces, no, you wouldn't wear those around outside of the festival. Yeah, those are very heavy, and they're often brought. They're purchased as gifts for the sisters by people who are patrons of the Irmandade. There's another Irmandade in Salvador, Nossa Senhora do Rosário dos Pretos, which is it's a brotherhood. It's made up of men, and they're also involved with Candomblé. And in their church in Pelourinho, the historical center that I showed you a picture of, all of the Stations of the Cross, Jesus is portrayed as black. So there's some of that going on, but that would be something you would do in Salvador, the big city. But in the countryside, hasn't exactly reached there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation and the hospitality.